Next to him. The audience to meet you, another one thinking, well, he must be new too. What, really? It's something.
Let's please give a very warm welcome to Mary Hall.
Thank you very much. I have to be real honest with you. This group gives me tremendous amount of hope. I've been apologizing to a lot of people lately because I feel like all of last year I was totally Debbie Downer following the election. And the recent election, while turnout was low here locally, kind of gave me hope. That people are paying attention across the country, and I think that's more important now than ever. And it's interesting, people always say, how did you get into elections? And it's certainly not a career that anybody plans on when they're a child. But I can honestly say what's interesting, and this is a true story, when you're in your 20s and somebody says, what would you do if you won the lottery? And my answer was always like, I would make sure that everybody voted. I would start a nonprofit and I would buy every newspaper in the country because that's how you influence people. And it's really fascinating to see what's happened. That's how people are being influenced today, is through either voter suppression or buying up the media. And, that's happened across the country. And I think, this presentation, we really do have multiple things going on in our elections that are influencing. And the first thing I want to talk about is redistricting and gerrymandering, because that's sort of gotten us to where we are, to be honest. And redistricting is if you really look at history, is fairly new. Modern redistricting really only began in the 1960s. It happened in one way or another, but it wasn't until the 1960s that they started looking at one person, one vote, making equal populations, and set up laws to where we now have a census every 10 years and redistrict. And if you want to remember when it happens, the census always happens in the years ending in 0. Redistricting happens in the years ending in 1, and we vote on all the new districts in the years ending in 2. So 2002 was the first year we used the new districts following the 2000 census. 2012 was the first election following the 2010 census, and the next election when we'll have new districts will be 2022. And how we got to where we are, basically a couple lawsuits. In 1962, there was a challenge to Equal Protection Clause, 14th Amendment of the Constitution, that we really didn't have equal representation. Also, the one person, one vote. You had a lot of disproportionate influence where you may have had the population centers in the city, you had a lot more influence in the rural counties. So in 1964 and 65, they changed the laws to bring us really to where we are today. And, redistricting is important because it levels the playing field. It makes districts equal in population and ensures that we have fair representation. And it's also what determines where federal funding goes. So now jurisdictions are starting to see the importance of it because that's how the federal government doles out the dollars. As I mentioned earlier, prior to redistricting, rural counties had a disproportionate share of power and representation. So there are a lot of good things about redistricting if done correctly. And we have some rules and guidelines that we have to, or we should follow. And one is to make the districts compact, make them contiguous. So you wouldn't have, say, Tumwater and Yelm in the same district with all of this other space in between. So making them compact and also preserving communities of interest. So we were very fortunate in Thurston County in the last redistricting cycle because all of Thurston County is in one congressional district. And there were a lot of people responsible for that. Stu Henderson, I remember testifying, of how important that was. And the Redistricting Commission really does listen to citizen testimony. So keep that in mind in the future. Now this is the bad part of redistricting, and this here is actually what gave gerrymandering its name. This was actually the district in Maryland by Governor Gerry, and that's how they came up with the term gerrymandering. And these are actually congressional districts today, which is pretty amazing. You know, you have to wonder what they're drawing around, but you know, these hardly could be called compact, you know, barely contiguous, but they've done a lot of things to manipulate districts across the country, and I'll give you some state examples in a little bit. So gerrymandering, of course, is intended to give a political advantage to one group, and while it's not new, it's changed. You know, prior to the 60s, they really viewed it as a political thing. The courts didn't get involved that much. But in the last couple cycles, people have started paying attention because it has, it's been influencing our elections. Let's be real honest about it. So there are a couple tactics. One is called cracking, the other is called packing. And I'll give you an example in just a minute, but you know, there's very sophisticated technology today to look at the possibilities, and that's really what people do leading up to redistricting. You know, we have precincts, and some of you may be precinct committee officers, and we are required by state law to report results by precinct. And while it really doesn't serve many purposes, it serves this purpose because it allows lawmakers to really see what area of the population is voting for whom, which, you know, lets them know where their support is. So when we get to the drawing of the precincts, you know, commissioners are always interested in how we're drawing our precincts, but that's really has really nothing to do with anything. It's really how they draw the districts, the legislative, the congressional, the county council districts. And we're fortunate in this state, we've got a good system, but it's certainly not true across the country. So this kind of gives you a good example of how it's done. So this first square here, we've got, you know, a 60-40 split. This is one district. It's pretty equal, no influence. This is how they might draw very fair districts. If you notice, we've got 2 purple, 3 green, 40% purple, 60% green. That's pretty fair. That's a very fair way to draw districts based on this example. This is a way that you would impact making it totally skewed one direction. If you drew your districts this way, even though you've got 40% purple, because you've drawn them horizontally, you're basically giving all the power to the green districts. Now the last example, that's pretty fair. It's drawn a different way, but the way this is for the purple, just by the way that they drew them, okay? So when people look at data, you know, what they're doing is geocoding the votes, and then they'll come up with various scenarios to see what is going to be most advantageous for them. So we're very fortunate in this state is that we actually have a redistricting commission. It's made up of 4 members and 1 non-voting members. And the way they're selected, it's a Democrat from the House, a Republican from the House, a Democrat from the Senate, a Republican from the Senate. And they have to draw the districts, and they have to agree on these districts for them to become law. So typically the vote is 4-0, but I can tell you in the last redistricting cycle, which my job was to follow the state redistricting, the deadline is New Year's Day at midnight, and they finished at about 10 to midnight on New Year's Day. Wow. So it was really, really down to the wire.
Who was the fifth? how's the fifth?
The fifth is really the chair that plans the meetings, facilitates the meetings, but does not have voting rights.
But comes from where? How is
Is appointed.
Appointed.
Appointed by the 4 commissioners.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is how the process happens. So the caucuses appoint the members, and they'll meet in January 2021. In 2011, they had 30 meetings, so they did travel across the state and had a lot of public hearings listening to stakeholders in various communities. Negotiations happen. Each member creates their own plan, and then it's the jockeying and the horse trading, if you will. And while it's somewhat of an open process, there's still a lot of discussion that happens behind closed doors, there's no doubt. But after they approve it, then the legislature has an opportunity to petition the courts to make changes if there's a 2/3 majority that wants to change them. And that actually did happen in 2011. Up in Pierce County, the town of Fircrest was actually split. So was the town of Wilkeson. But the senator in the 28th district was successful getting the redistricting commission or legislature to agree to make Fircrest wholly contained within the 28th district. Wilkeson was not so fortunate. They continued to be split. I don't recall if it was a legislative or congressional district, but little tiny Wilkeson was split down the middle. So if they can't reach a decision of what the plan is going to be, then the courts have until March 1st to come up with a plan. And from an election administrator standpoint, that is like the worst thing that could ever happen, because for those of you that have been in Washington State for a long time, if you remember, we used to have our primary in September, and we used to have filing week the last week of July. With the August primary, filing week is now 2 weeks after Memorial Day, which means our precincts have to be final the last week in April. So that, if this were to happen, it would literally give us very little time, a very tight window to do the work that we do, which is redrawing all the precincts to make sure that we put all the voters in the right districts. So we're working on legislation to move some of these dates. So the criteria, as I mentioned earlier, have to be as equal in population as practicable. And for congressional districts, in the last redistricting cycle, it was 672,000 voters or citizens approximately, 137,000 for legislative districts. And they also have to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act, meaning that they can't favor any minority or population over the other. Now, whether that happens across the country, I would venture to say it doesn't, but
Every state has its own laws about how this is done.
correct. Every state writes their own laws. And that's true for all election law. But they have to be contiguous, compact, respect jurisdiction boundaries. And they're also not supposed to favor incumbents. Now, in the last redistricting cycle, there are actually 2 legislators that did get drawn out of their districts. However, they were also drawn into very, very safe districts. Ed Orcutt, I believe, went from the 18th through the 20th, and Representative Gary Alexander went from the 20th to the 2nd. But it was interesting when you look at the 9th, I would venture a guess that they kind of drew that around the congressional member up there. So we're very fortunate in this state, and there are only 6 others in the country that have redistricting commissions. It really does limit gerrymandering, in my opinion, and it also gives citizens an opportunity to weigh in on the process. The challenge is it's still controlled by the parties. And because of the caucus appointments, incumbency probably is a factor as well. They're going to protect their own, I would imagine. And while I mentioned all the draft maps are discussed in public, I would venture to say that there's a lot that happens, behind closed doors and discussions and things like that. But I will take this system over what they have in the rest of the country any day. So there are local jurisdictions that have redistricting commissions as well. Pierce County has their own redistricting commission. So does Whatcom, King, Snohomish. But they're not all created equal. What's interesting about the Pierce County redistricting model, it may look the same, but what happens up there is whoever they appoint as the redistricting master really has the plan, because they will present their final plan, and then the 4 members either have to give it an up or down vote. If they can't agree on it, then the redistricting master's plan becomes the plan. So you really have to read between the lines. And it was fascinating for me to watch the Pierce County process 10 years ago. People like football, I like redistricting. It was fascinating looking at the maps because I understand the demographics so well. So we'll see what happens in Thurston County. We're unique in that just because of the compactness and small geographic size of our county, it's very difficult to draw them to favor any one political body. I know there are a lot of people who would love to have a South County Commissioner district, but my staff has drawn the districts. It doesn't matter if you go vertically, which is the way we are now, or horizontally. It's really still going to be the same makeup. And that's, of course, because the population centers, really, you could call Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater Tri-Cities, really. Yep. The population is really all in the center of the county. So you would literally have to draw it like a U or something to come up with, a county that didn't reflect the progressive nature of this county, to be honest. So these are our current commissioner districts. So you can see they kind of go north and south, and they've tried, but really, all of the population is really right in this area. So I'm not sure, unless we went to 5 commissioners, I think that would be the only opportunity to give the south part of the county, their own representation, which I would favor 5. I think that would be a good thing to do. But so how do you engage? It's going to be coming up fairly soon. Whoever is in power in 2020, who's elected in that election, is going to be influential in the 2021 redistricting. And that includes both state, congressional, and county commissioner districts. So these next elections are really, really critical. And if you think about it, I don't know how much people have followed it, but North Carolina used to actually be an amazingly progressive state as it related to voting laws. I got my national certification in 2004 and actually went to school. It's about a 2-year program. I went to school with some people from North Carolina, and they just had amazing laws, and I was always so envious of everything they had in place. And what happened in North Carolina was they really worked hard, somehow took back the legislature, redrew all of the districts to make them safe districts, and just totally dismantled and reversed all of the progress they made for access to voting. And I'll show you one of their districts in a little bit. Oh, right here, which is interesting. So I love the North Carolina League of Women Voters. I'm not sure what event this was, but they had a 5K race, and they decided to make the race course this gerrymandered district. So this is how the race course went. It was brilliant. What a way to bring attention to this issue. So I thought it was just so fascinating. And I have no idea, what's going on in there. I would love to talk to somebody from North Carolina and have them explain this district. But kudos to the League of Women Voters for finding such a creative way to bring attention to the gerrymandering that is taking place in that state. And this is a good transition into, other ways that people influence elections. Gerrymandering is just one way, but it's an important way because you always hear that we have really safe congressional districts across the country, and it's true, and it's how, I think it's how the Republicans have stayed in power. And we've got a lot of pending court cases right now, too, around redistricting and gerrymandering. So stay tuned. It's going to be very interesting to see how they rule. Other ways that they're trying to affect voting is voter suppression, voter ID laws. And voter ID laws are really in place to combat voter impersonation. But they have yet to prove that this is an issue. I mean, people do not go in and claim to be somebody else and try to sign in and steal their vote. There's absolutely no proof to that whatsoever. When they really get down and do the analysis, it's really election worker errors. When people sign the poll books, there's a little barcode next to it, and you scan those barcodes, and that's how you give credit in your voting system. And when they really dissect all of this, what they find is that they just scanned the wrong barcode or somebody signed on the wrong line. But there really is no evidence that we've had any voter impersonation in this country. And, millions of illegal votes. Again, there's no proof for that at all. What's coming now before us are citizen checks. And it's interesting that Trump was saying all these illegal people voted and non-citizens, and I can tell you why that doesn't happen. If somebody votes and they're not a citizen, that's automatic deportation. And if they have any desire to become a citizen of this country, that's a roadblock. So what we find in our office as election administrators, and this is true of every election office across the state and probably the country, we do have motor voters, so people accidentally get registered. But when they find out they're registered and it's an issue, I mean, they'll come in like desperate begging for a certificate that we provide them that proves they never voted. So they may have been registered, but they haven't voted. And this has been going on for as long as I've been in the industry, which is about 21 years. So they don't vote, and I wish they'd just quit saying that. Our budgets get cut a lot, so just access to voting and funding for elections is becoming a problem. And opposing legislation that would give greater access to voting. And I'm so optimistic this year with winning the 45th district because I am fingers crossed this year we're going to pass same-day registration. Deadlines were put in place before we had technology. We don't need deadlines anymore. We don't have poll books. We don't have polling places. So there's no reason that somebody shouldn't be able to come into my office, get a ballot, and vote. We've got technology to do that. I'm sure everybody's heard of automatic voter registration, which is what they did in Oregon, which is super exciting. In this state, it doesn't work quite as well because we don't have citizen checks when you get your driver's license. So for it to work in this state really evenly across the board, we really need to have social service agencies that do citizen checks like the ACA or DSHS. If we're going to do automatic registration, it would have to be with just enhanced driver's license, CDLs. Both of those have citizen checks. But we really need to get the social service agencies involved to make it level of who would be automatically registered. And then the other thing that I think is important, and King County did a pilot program, is prepaid postage. I mean, we vote by mail, which is awesome, and vote by mail states do have higher voter turnout than the rest of the country, even though 35% may seem dismally low. It could be 10% in California. So But because we vote by mail, there are a lot of people, especially young people, they don't know what stamps are. They're not used to snail mail. So, prepaid postage really wouldn't cost that much money. 75% of the ballots we get back in Thurston County come in through our drop boxes. So not a lot comes in through the mail. What's most frightening to me right now is Trump's Commission on Election Integrity, which is, what's interesting, I'm surprised, or I was very surprised when he said 3 to 5 million illegal votes, and yet he won the election. And I think it's just because he didn't win the popular vote that he had to say something. But they're very clever. When the memo came out, it was the Thursday before the 4th of July holiday. So all Washington election administrators were at our election conference. We have an annual conference every year. And it came out on a Thursday, and Senator Sam Hunt is the one who emailed that to me. And it just shocked me when it's like, okay, what do they want with all of our voter rolls? But because of the timing, it made it very difficult for election administrators to respond. I got home on a Friday. I was on the phone on Saturday of 4th of July weekend with my attorney, with my deputy, and they still work for me. I'm so happy. But, what can we do? And, unfortunately, by the time I was able to pull it together and talking with our attorney and public records attorney, it was too late and the Washington records had already been sent. I simply wanted to protect Thurston County voter records, but when I made the call to Kim Wyman, they had already been sent. So the unfortunate thing is, if you remember, we had this marathon legislative session. There was still time to get the legislature to react. And I wish we would have taken that opportunity. But, hindsight's 20/20, so.
What information did she send?
It's everything that would be available to a campaign. So name, date of birth, address, mailing address, voting history.
Oh, yeah.
Pardon me? No social security numbers, no driver's license numbers.
Do you have any idea how those 74 votes were distributed across parties?
No, because the question was, do we know how the votes were distributed across parties? We don't, because once the secrecy envelope is removed from the outer envelope, we don't know who's voted is, and we didn't discover this until well after the election. But I'll tell you about the 3 that we had in Thurston County. So, of the 3.36 million votes cast, there were 74 cases of what they're calling voter fraud, or really they were double voting incidents. We had 2, they say 3 in Thurston County. One was a woman who had moved away, got married, changed her name, and registered in a different county. So we forwarded the ballot to her based on the information from change of address from the post office, and she had registered in a new county. So the statewide voter registration system does a great job of dupe checking, but it wouldn't have caught that. Second incident was, it was like a K. Michael and a Michael K. So again, names were reversed. The third one was a student, and we actually were able to intercept the second ballot and it didn't get counted. But I think what's important to note is with those 74 ballots that people voted twice, number one, the people were so scared when they got a letter from us. They were confused. They didn't know what to do with 2 ballots, so they voted them both. And it certainly wasn't intentional fraud. And we're required to speak with every one of these people, and I can tell you they will never do it again just based on the letter they get from us. But it was an honest mistake. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't an organized effort. And to put laws in place for something like that, what you're really doing is preventing tens of thousands of people from voting, or, to protect a tiny flaw that you're never going to be able to fix, regardless of the system that you have. So a little more about the commission. Chris Kobach, I'm sure everybody has heard that name. He's been sued 4 times successfully by the ACLU. He has a reputation for voter suppression. He tried to put 2 different laws in place in Kansas, 2 databases, one for federal elections, one for state elections that would make, the ID and things like that more restrictive. Both were voted or ruled illegal. He was sued for not providing memos under the Public Records Act. And it's very evident what his end goal is. He really wants to unravel the National Voter Registration Act. The National Voter Registration Act was enacted in 1993, and it's one of the best pieces of legislation that has ever come about for voting. It's what gave us motor voter. It's what gave us safety nets. And what he really doesn't like is what we call inactive voters. So if let's say your son moves away, okay? They don't think to call our office that they've moved, okay? So we mail something, it comes back as undeliverable. We essentially don't know where that voter is. But instead of canceling the voter, they go on what's called an inactive list. And that's what Chris Kobach is wanting to eliminate, which is the safety net. And when they're on the inactive list, we don't send them a ballot, but all they have to do is pick up the phone and say, I didn't get my ballot, or I've moved, and they're still technically registered. And this is federal across the country. It's a safety net, and it's a safety net that we need to maintain. We don't want to just start throwing people off the rolls. That's happening enough across the country. He also wants to require proof of citizenship. And he is the developer of a system called Crosscheck. And I did a presentation a couple years ago about Crosscheck versus ERIC. In this country, there are two different systems that do cross-matching across states to clean the rolls. We want our voter rolls to be as clean as possible. Unfortunately, the cross-check system doesn't take into account middle name or middle initial. So there was a study done by Microsoft and Stanford, and I think MIT was involved in this as well. And they found that for every 1 valid duplicate record, there were 200 false positives. Think about that on a national basis. I was reading an article the other night that if you take everybody across the country, there are like 3 million people who have the same name and date of birth. I mean, there are only so many names. And I think we have good enough laws in this state that, let us do our job. We know what we're doing, and we will prevent fraud and double voting. What we use in this state is called ERIC, Electronic Registration Information Center, and that works really well. 20 states use this system. It was developed by the Pew Charitable Trust. I trust the Pew Charitable Trust, and they have no stake in the game, and they're very involved in elections, and I would like to see that in place nationwide. If Crosscheck goes into use nationwide, we have some real concerns. Talked about them requesting all of the data from all the states, and a lot of states didn't have to comply. I wish we would have been one that could have withheld that. But that in itself was a form of voter suppression. In Colorado, they had 4,000 people that canceled their voter registrations. Most people don't know that their voter registration information is public. And I'm hoping that the legislature addresses that and at least holds back some parts of the information, because we do have a lot of identity theft and things like that. So the commission is not very transparent. They haven't been sharing information with the Democratic Secretary of States that are on the commission. So one of them sued to get access to that information. So, a lot of people are saying, oh, the commission is dead, it's history. I really hope that's the case, but, that really is yet to be seen. There's a lot going on besides just the commission. In 2017, there were 99 bills introduced in 31 states across the country that are designed to restrict voter access. And you have these think tanks out there, you know, ALEC is one that comes to mind. And there are a lot of think tanks out there that they have brainstorming sessions on how we can, or how they can, you know, disrupt the vote. And how are they doing it? Voter purges, voter ID laws, requiring proof of citizenship, closing polling places, and also shortening the early voting periods. And they're doing that in select locations that are based on demographics. And this is a fact, you know, people are less likely to vote the further they must travel. And the longer they must wait in line. I mean, think how fortunate we are. We get to get our ballot at home, sit down at the table, go through a voter's pamphlet. Can you imagine having to wait in line for 8 hours? I mean, I would do it, and I'm sure all of you would too. But think of the people that don't have the time or, you know, just physically can't do it. So, yeah, jobs. In 2000, of course, if you remember that election, it was the state of Florida, Catherine Harris, who purged all the voters, saying they were felons. Again, there were many, many, many false positives. But that was before we had the provisional ballot safety net that came about from the Help America Vote Act. So the people that were purged in Florida, they were out of luck. They had no recourse, and they just couldn't vote. And 557 votes decided the outcome of our presidential election, which is very frightening. You know, there was a study by Rutgers that found in the 2016 election, Ohio purged 144,000 voters in the 3 largest counties. Now you can imagine the 3 largest counties were probably, you know, urban areas. So think about the voter makeup of those areas. And that's why, you know, what they're doing to voter laws and voter records, I mean, is very scary right now, and it's a big threat to our democracy. You know, in Wisconsin used to have same-day registration, which they recently repealed, but they enacted voter ID laws in 2011, and University of Wisconsin did a study that 17,000 people were denied the right to vote because of those laws. And in Ohio and Virginia, if they don't have a voter ID, they have to go back and prove it, you know, and then show ID. They have 10 days in Ohio, 3 days in Virginia. So a lot of those people don't go back either. So this is how they're really impacting elections across this country. And this gives you kind of a show of the various voter ID laws across the country. It's a trend, but you've got the trends going both ways. And while, you know, we show green, our laws actually aren't too bad. We have online voter registration. We're one of the first states to do that. So the dark green are strict photo ID laws. The lighter green, this one here, strict non-photo ID. This one, photo ID requested. So these, we have voter ID required when you register online. Basically what we do here in Washington State is we bounce against the Department of Licensing database. So you key in your license number. As long as we can find a match at DOL, you're registered. If we can't find a match, then you have to send us some sort of ID before we'll count your ballot. You could enclose a utility bill, something with your name and address on it, and we would be able to count your ballot. And then the gray states are, there's no documents required to vote. And the thing you got to keep in mind is when you vote, you sign an affidavit that you swear this is you, you're eligible to vote, and there are penalties if you're not who you say you are or you're not eligible to vote. And there are penalties in every state. And there is no proof that we've ever had voter fraud in this country. But they say it enough and people are believing it. So voter access restrictions are certainly on the rise. You know, as I mentioned, they're closing polling places, shortening early voting laws, and there's been a lot of dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, which has been really sad. And when they overturned the Voting Rights Act Shelby decision, 165 of the 381 counties that were covered under that part of the Voting Rights Act went and revised their laws. It used to be, if you were one of those states, you actually had to go to the Department of Justice to get permission to make these changes. But once they eliminated that, they can do whatever they want, and they're doing it at a rapid pace. So as I mentioned, North Carolina, 30% of the counties closed polling places, and they happen disproportionately around colleges and universities, and where there was a large African American population. So can you imagine, Maricopa County went from 200 to 60 polling places. That's amazing. So 4 to 5 hour waits in line. The good news is, vote by mail is starting to take off, so that's a good thing. So Florida also reduced the early voting period. Georgia reduced the early voting period dramatically, and Ohio cut out what they used to call the Golden Week, which was when somebody could actually go in, they could get registered and vote at the same time. Very convenient, and they eliminated that time period. So North Carolina, I mentioned earlier, they used to have pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. They used to have same-day registration. And all of that has been overturned as a result of the redistricting and the gerrymandering they did to change the makeup of the legislature. So, any questions? Now, I like to call this Stump the Auditor. This is my favorite part. I'm going to have the woman back here who had her hand up earlier.
Yeah, a couple things about the cross-check system. So, well, taking Chris Kobach first, if he's been sued 4 times successfully and he did what you said were illegal things, how has he not been held responsible for those things? And then how is the cross-check system, how are we getting away with that? I mean, 30 states are using it, right? So if 20 aren't, then is there something like 30 that are?
Not necessarily. 20 are using ERIC. There are some that use nothing at all. I don't know exactly how many use cross-check.
That's what I heard. Something like half is what I heard.
How is he getting away with it? You know, courts are up to each state. I mean, laws are unique to each state. So I really don't know how he's getting away with it. I believe they overturned some of the things he tried to put into place. For example, having 2 separate databases, I don't think they allowed that to happen.
And what about him personally, in terms of being held responsible? I mean, he's the leader of elections in the country. I mean, I don't know how you get to that position, certainly, but has he not been held responsible for some of the illegal things that he's done? And
apparently not. He's active on the commission, so yeah. Yep. Question.
What do you think of ranked choice voting?
So I was fortunate to actually be working in Pierce County when they did ranked choice voting back in 2008 and 2009. And we were the first in Washington State to implement ranked choice voting. It took us about 2 years to plan for that. It was very expensive.
What is it?
Ranked choice voting. So ranked choice voting, the way we did it in Washington State, let's say you have 7 candidates running for something. It eliminates, first off, it eliminates a primary. So there is no primary. So in Pierce County, you got a ballot, and if you had the ability to rank 3 candidates. So you could say, this is my first choice, this is my second choice, this is my third choice. If your first choice doesn't have the most votes, that is eliminated, or I should say it has the last place votes. That is eliminated. and your second vote is distributed to the candidates. And they do this distribution until there's a majority. So what this does, it does a couple things. It cleans up elections. Candidates aren't as nasty to each other because they want the second vote. Okay, if I'm not your first choice, please make me your second choice. I think it also allows people outside of the mainstream to have a better chance because you're not throwing your vote away, so to speak, if you vote for, say, a third-party candidate. I actually worked with the folks in Minnesota. They do it manually, which is amazing. I have a lot of respect for them. They vote that way in Australia. I had this conversation at a dinner party with the person from Australia on Saturday night. And there are a lot of good things about ranked choice voting. Do I see it coming to Washington State soon? I don't know. You know, I doubt it.
Parties don't want it.
The parties don't want it, and I loved it.
Why didn't it stick in Pierce County?
Good question. Why didn't it stick in Pierce County? I think it was confusing to voters, and the way they implemented ranked choice voting in Pierce County was strictly for county races. So voters got 2 ballots. One had all the congressional candidates, the state legislative candidates, and any ballot measures or initiatives. And then they got a ranked choice voting ballot. And it was very confusing. And then there was also a candidate for treasurer who was really out there. He was a perpetual candidate. We all know those who run every year.
Or something.
Yeah, for something. And just because there were so many candidates in this race, especially on the Republican side of the race, he ended up getting elected and ended up costing Pierce County millions of dollars in lawsuits and things like that. So there was enough negative press about ranked choice voting that while they had to conduct it again in 2009 for an open auditor seat, they also had an initiative on the ballot to repeal it, and they did. So the Voting Rights Act that I hope passes this year does have a provision in it currently to allow municipalities or to allow for alternate voting. I'm not sure if it's just for municipalities. So that would at least open it up to where if jurisdictions chose to do that, they could. From an administrator standpoint, it's very expensive, and I've actually talked to election vendors. The ranked choice voting folks really need to settle on the rules nationwide so vendors know how to write the algorithms. But it was one of the funnest things I ever did.
The Voting Rights Act, you said, is up for,
It's a Washington Voting Rights Act.
what does that include?
It really is more about voting by district. It came as a result of a legal challenge in Yakima County. It's a largely Hispanic city, and because they voted at large, they felt that the Hispanic candidates really weren't, they weren't allowed to run in a geographic area with the voting population that reflected their views. So it's basically about district-based elections.
It had the designation of only city in the country with nearly 50% of the population, people of color or Hispanic and Latino, but not a single city council member was person of color.
And now I think there are 3 or 4.
Now
Since they've implemented that. Florence?
So you mentioned they tested it in King County, something in King
Pierce.
County?
Prepaid.
No, a prepaid.
Prepaid postage.
What was the result?
What was the result of prepaid postage in King County? It certainly increased turnout.
Good.
Yeah. And that's really what we should be focusing on is participation in our democracy. And what price democracy? I mean, let's do it. So.
I had a question. One is that what the King County is doing, everybody will get for the local elections 4 vouchers, $25, and how we do that. So there's outside money cannot influence and buy the elections. That is one. But the second thing is, what about state citizens? What about people who are in a conundrum for 20 years for their citizenship? So can they somehow have a voice in the city and county level at least?
Did everybody hear the questions? So the question one was talking about the democracy voucher program in King County, which I'll talk about in a moment. And there are people who have been trying to get their citizenship who are having a hard time getting that, and could they vote on the state and local level? And that would require legislation, but I don't remember how this came up, but it was just last week that somebody actually brought that up. I don't know if it's legislation that's been introduced in another state, but that's really up to each state, because states govern their own election laws.
Are there states that allow it?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I know there are states that allow 17-year-olds to vote in municipal elections, which I think would be awesome. So I think you had your hand up. Did you still have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about two things. One of them is the Washington Voter Rights Act the only piece of legislation that will be coming across the transom at the state legislature this year about voting? And how can we as citizens support the Washington Voting Rights Act?
The question was, is that the only piece of legislation that's going to be presented to the legislature voting this year? And the answer is no. We've got a lot of them. What I'm very hopeful for is that we can actually pass same-day registration in this state. And if you want to get involved and contact your legislators, in Thurston County, Senator Sam Hunt is a huge proponent. And I just want to say we are so lucky to have him, because the one thing that is really obvious to me as I look at the events that have happened across the country since 2000 is it's always due to the fact that they have weak voting laws. And in Washington State, we have very strong voting laws, and it is largely due to Senator Sam Hunt. He was the chair when he was in the House of Representatives. He chaired the House State Government Operations Committee and was a huge proponent. We have very good law in Washington State. I wish they would just take our state law and put it in every state across the country, because they've really listened to us. And, former Secretary of State Sam Reed was actually more progressive than you would think and did a good job as well. So this year, we're hopefully going to get same-day registration now that we control the House, Senate, and the governor's office. Yeah, that would be awesome. The prepaid postage, automatic voter registration. What's really near and dear to me is pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. I mean, we have motor voter in this country, but we're losing a huge population. And, studies show that if kids will exercise the right to vote, if they start voting early when they're 18, they tend to become consistent voters. If they don't, we lose them until well after 35, until they have children. And that's a really large voting group that we need to get involved in our elections.
Given the fact you've been doing this over 20 years, and with what you just shared, it seems that this whole process is very subject to manipulation and to agendas. Mm-hmm. Does any of that, as it changes over your career, represent any ethical dilemmas in doing your job?
Does it present any ethical dilemmas? It's funny because we're required to do continuing education every 3 years once we get certified, and that's always one of the things, ethical dilemmas. No, I would dive for a vote and scrape my egg, if you watch, everybody who watched the 2000 election, you saw the canvassing board who was looking at those votes. I think when you're an elections administrator, I'm a Democrat, I'm a democratically elected auditor, and there's no doubt about it that I have very strong beliefs, but I'm an election administrator first, and it's about the process. It's all about the process. So I I have not felt that I've had any ethical dilemmas, because when I walk into my office, party doesn't matter. It's not, I don't ask people if they're a Democrat or Republican to register to vote. I just want people to vote. It's up to the parties, it's up to the candidates, it's up to them to convince people that they need to vote for them. That's not my role at all. My role is to ensure as many people can register and vote, and to keep it as honest and transparent as possible. And that is my mission.
Is there a reason that we're in Washington not like Oregon and California in terms of just letting anybody register? Why do we have that one step removed where you compare the licenses to them?
My memory seems to, in 2006, we implemented the Help America Vote Act, which came out of the 2000 election. That was Congress's answer to that. And I want to say it happened around that time, but it's not really restrictive, because we at least allow people to present an alternate form of ID. There are some places where it has to be driver's license or birth certificate. I mean, for us, it can be a student ID. It doesn't necessarily have to have a picture on it. We just want to know that you are a human being who live in Washington State at the address you claim to live in. So it's not as restrictive as some of the voter ID laws across the country. And personally, I'm okay with it. Because they're, if they don't have a driver's license, they can enter the last 4 digits of their social security number and will bounce against that. But I think it creates a little more confidence in the system, and I don't think that we are disenfranchising people, to be honest.
Mary, it was also part of the negotiations which happened at the state legislature when the extreme right wing were saying they were putting, it was a compromise
Okay.
from the Democratic side. I still remember because I was lobbying for it, I was there.
Oh, okay.
So it was because the other side was putting so many restrictions, enormous amount of restrictions. So eventually the Progressive Caucus said, okay, how about we meet here rather than
Okay.
right there.
And we'll get this and we'll give you that.
Exactly. Because
Okay,
otherwise they
that
were
would make
asking-
sense.
And they were also asking that people who don't have a citizenship cannot have driver's licenses, or and they were very restrictive. So this was, and then we said no. And then if they don't have social security numbers, they should not be given a driver's license. And that was,
Yeah, that
it
doesn't,
disenfranchises so many people
Sure.
who are on that track. So
Right.
that was the,
Okay.
and it went on for 3-4 years, and there was a lot of work which was done at legislature.
so there you go. Question.
How are the votes counted?
How are the votes counted? We use scanners, optical scanners that, you connect or you fill in the oval, and they're read by scanners. One of the things we do in Washington State, it's voluntary right now, but we do it every election, is post-election audits. So what we will do to ensure that first of all, let me back up. Even before Election Day, we have what we call our logic and accuracy test. So what we do is we pre-mark ballots with an expected outcome, okay? We run them through the tabulator to ensure that we're going to get the outcome that we expected. Okay, so that's what we do pre-election, and we do a tremendous amount of testing to make sure our programming is correct. We also have a formal test where the Secretary of State comes and actually validates all of this for us. The other thing that we do are post-election audits. And there's talk to make this mandatory, which I would certainly support because we do it every election anyway. But the day after the election, we will take a precinct and we will run the precinct through the tabulators, print the results, and then we will do a hand count. And we'll hand count those ballots to ensure that they match what the machine said. So that's an after-election check. And the thing that you have to keep in mind, the best check we have in Washington State are hand recounts. And we have very good recount laws in this state. The threshold for a hand recount is less than 150 vote difference and 1/4 of 1%. And I've done a lot of recounts in my career, which I love. Hand recounts are my favorite thing. And the votes don't change. I mean, they really don't change. And if they do change one vote here or there, it's something that was missed in the visual inspection, because Washington State, we're required to visually inspect every ballot because we're what they call a voter intent state. So as long as we can determine the intent of the voter, we will correct a ballot. So if they circle the oval and it's not in what we call the target area, the scanner's not going to pick that up. But the intent of the voter is pretty clear. So we will actually pull a ballot, an exact ballot like that, and transfer those votes to this other ballot. And we do it in teams of 2 and then have another team of 2 audit them. And there's a control number on the original ballot and the control number on the ballot that the votes were duplicated onto, so they can always be tied back together. So we have a manual that actually came out as a result of the Help America Vote Act. It's called our Voter Intent Manual, and it's basically what constitutes a vote. So regardless of how a voter marked the ballot, if they corrected it, they spilled food on it, made a check mark outside the target area. We have this book as a guide, so every county in the state of Washington is handling that in the exact same manner.
Wow.
I'm going to go back in the back. Sure. And then I'll come to you.
About 2 years ago, I talked to 48 voters, non-voters, half of the non-voters in my precinct. And a quarter of those people, which is a dozen or so, were saying, why do the ballots come so far after the voter guide? I get my voter guide, I don't have my ballot, I put it aside. I don't have my ballot, where did I put the voter guide? I can't vote until I have the voter guide.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I guess I'm too late. That was what I was told at the door. I'm just wondering, why don't they come out together?
Good question.
Well, the voter pamphlet that comes from the state, keep in mind, they have to print and mail to like millions of people. So they use printers and mail houses all over the state. We always try to target ours about a week before the ballot comes out, because keep in mind that military ballots are mailed 45 days prior to the election. So you try to hit that sweet spot in the middle somewhere. So that's one of the reasons why.
I think just one more question. There.
Sure. Oh, I'm sorry. 2 more, okay? Okay.
Minnesota has the best voting record in the nation in terms of the percentage of registered voters that actually vote. And when I came here and I was exposed to the excellent pamphlets we get and everything like that. Then I was surprised, though, that really not as many people voted as did in Minnesota. And so why is that? And what can be done to help increase that?
That's a really good question. And our focus has been getting people to register. And I think we've done a great job. If you look at what we've done in the last 4 years versus the 4 years before that, we've done a good job getting people to register. Now we got to focus on how do we get people to vote. So if you want to, this could be an effort from everybody, but I will tell you, I've talked to my staff, and that is certainly going to be our focus in the coming years, is how do we increase turnout. And really it's my job too. The National Voter Registration Act in the first paragraph says it is a duty of federal, state, and local election officials to increase voter registration and turnout. So I take that very seriously. It's a resource issue, but I'm hoping that I've just got a millennial voter outreach person coming on board. I'm so super excited, and that's going to be our big focus. So yeah, I don't know. I had one more question here. Okay, and then.
So there was the whole Russian interference in state by state by state, and we got notified. There was, 32 states. Can you talk a little bit about what was that interference? And
Yes, thank you for asking that question, and I'll try to be brief. The Russian interference. So the one thing you have to keep in mind is we really are talking about two different things. We have voter registration systems, which is what the Russians really were able to hack into. That's the only thing that's connected to the internet. Tabulation systems are separate systems, and none of them are networked to the outside world. I mean, they are very safe. I mean, we literally use thumb drives. We buy thumb drives. We transfer the results from these tabulators to another machine that's also not networked to the internet. That is the only time that thumb drive is used. We archive it with the rest of our material, and then it's destroyed. So it's not like you're going to introduce viruses or anything like that. So these are two separate things. There really was no hacking in voter results, and there's no proof that they really manipulated any of the records. But I can tell you, it has certainly brought a very laser focus into election security and cybersecurity, and elections has been named part of the critical infrastructure. So we did a lot before that election that you don't hear about because we don't talk about what we're doing security-wise. But believe me, we did a complete sweep in September and October to make sure that everything was fine, because we were nervous just like everybody else. So anyway, this has been a pleasure. Thank you very much. This is my favorite topic, so thank you.
That the discussion, open source code, so that the discussion can be moved from parties to what are the rules this code is supposed to follow, and does the code do what the rules say it's supposed to do? So, it's a discussion.